Hi there and welcome to Mastering Hard Surface, Lesson 4. So in the last lesson, we didn't actually get to cover very much modeling itself because we're so new to the whole process of working from blueprints that I needed to kind of solidify in your mind that you have to start by tracing those curves so that later on your topology is going to flow correctly around the points that are going to be most obviously causing pinching, like the beveling and things like that. So there's a very specific reason why we were doing that. One of the students, after I made the lesson, had a bit of confidence to start trying to make one of his own models, and it was Iron Man helmet, and rather than blocking out the edges, kind of just went straight to blocking out the main faces, and that's what I was trying to avoid in this lesson. So what I've decided to do is, rather than jumping straight into lesson 4 rather than jumping into the lesson 4 that I was going to create, that was going to be focusing on detailing those bevels and things like that, I've decided that now that I've got a bit more time since the new website launch has been so successful and I don't have to do all those support emails and I'm not answering all those same, frequently asked questions over and over, that I do have a bit of time. I've got a couple of days completely free and I wanted to get ahead again on the course. So what we're going to do in this lesson is it's going to be a little bit more of a realistic kind of viewing lesson where I'll do my best to explain as I'm going kind of how I'm going to continue this process. But basically it's just going to be, the aim of this lesson is to fill in that gap between the lesson 3 and the lesson 4 I was going to make. So you can kind of consider this a bit of a lesson 3.5. So as usual, I've got all my reference images up, except this time, now that I'm going to kind of be trying to fill in some of those blanks for you so that when we do get to the next lesson and we are detailing more of a visible object and not just kind of some blocked out edges, I do need to look at a little bit more reference, see things in a different light, and you have to remember that all of these images, all 6 of them, are lit in a very similar way in the same studio by the same photographer, and they're not going to catch different lines to if it was, say, shot outdoors or in a showroom or something like that, something a little bit more realistic. We also don't know how much retouching has been done to this in order to smooth out some of the imperfections in the lighting, and that's another thing that just complicates that process a little bit more. So in order to avoid that confusion, like I was saying in the first lesson, I do have 2 screens, and this time I'm going to be kind of using reference on every possible area of the 2 spare screens, so that while I'm modeling, I don't have to keep looking back and forth between things to figure out what's going on. So we'll jump back into Max and I'll just continue that process of blocking out some lines, except this time I'm going to expand a little bit further and we're going to start blocking out some shapes as well. Now, in production, I'm usually not going to be modeling this slow, not unless it's a really relaxed day and I'm just kind of chilling out and I don't need to cane at it. But in a real production scenario, I'd be going as fast as I could. And in order for me to do that, I wouldn't be able to explain what I'm doing as I'm working because it takes up all that brain power to focus on the speed. So just remember, this isn't as fast as you would be modeling in production. And my ultimate goal is to get each and every one of you up to a standard where you do understand the laws behind hard surface modeling enough where you can just increase your speed yourself in your own time and when you practice. But at the very bare minimum, you're going to know the correct technique. So the only difference between you and someone who's faster is speed. It's not down to technique and it's not down to the cleanliness of your models or your topology. In an ideal situation, if I were to see 20 to 50 different students producing this same car model, the topology would end up very similar because you're working from that same workflow. And it wouldn't matter what car it is and kind of like what type of shape the car is. If you follow those same basic principles, you should end up at the same result. And that's exactly what I've seen from a couple of students so far who've been posting their work. That really nice low res and clean topology. And even though it's really basic and we're just getting started, it's really great to see that you guys are picking that up already. So I do like to see when you guys post your work, and if you are going to follow along, I'd it helps me to understand kind of what to expect from you guys, because at the moment, the only real expectation I have is kind of what I would be, or the only expectation I have is how I would learn from these tutorials myself when I was younger. So I'm trying to visualize the things that I wanted to be told while modeling that weren't in these tutorials, and when guys were just working and just going straight at it, they weren't explaining what they were doing, and you end up just kind of copying them. You're not learning how to model. So hopefully we can overcome that, and we're just going to keep working up slowly, and we're going to build up to those more complex shapes. And in later lessons, we'll kind of sometimes take a step backwards, sometimes take a step forwards, working on different things, just like I did in my own career, where sometimes I'd tackle really complex projects, and other times I'd just focus on really simple things like modeling bolts and screws and things like that. So let's jump into Max, and I'll just keep modeling. So before I start, I'm just going to, because it's been a couple of days since modeling this object, I'm just going to take a little bit of a look around the object, get a feel for what type of topology I'm going to drag out, where I'm going to start to drag things out first, and ultimately just get an idea in my head again of where the model's at. Now, I don't want to miss anything in these tutorials. I hate it. I absolutely hated it, and it's the reason why I stopped watching tutorials when guys just simply just cut ahead. You didn't see what was going on, and as someone who's really pedantic and wants to follow on exactly, and I'm sure there's going to be guys like you who just want to, they want to see absolutely every part of it, that I'm going to do my best to accommodate that and make it as easy as possible for you to kind of remember the workflow. So I'm going to try and work on the front of the car a little bit more than we had. The front of the car is going to serve as kind of the most obvious part of the car you're going to render. So that's probably where you want to put most of your effort. If you don't have the time to go in and refine absolutely every piece, and when I was working on print jobs that involved cars, before we had access to CAD data and things like that, we would only model the parts of the car where the clients had locked off camera positions for. So in most cases, that's usually going to be the front. I mean, there's obviously exceptions, but most of the time, you want to focus on the front of the car. So I'm just going to start trying to block out some of those lines, and we'll start working our way through it. And you can see I don't really have much regard for how I draw out topology, just as long as I can do that. So in that circumstance right there, I've just cut a line to be able to drag out, and then I've removed it again. So now I know that when I've got that plane there and I zoom in here, it's exactly aligned to that surface. Just makes things a little bit faster. I'm also just going to hide this back view just so it's not in the way. So here I'm just cutting away the grill, and I'm just going to hide that for now. And you can see I'm just trying to follow this line here. The blueprints really not that great. So we're just going to have to work with kind of what we've got. And if I zoom in, we're just trying to get this point sitting on this line. So now I'm just going to cut another line down here, just so that we can start to kind of dip the front grill part. And remember, if you've got a straight line to cut through, you don't have to cut. It's a good point to make out. If I'm trying to cut along this line here, what will happen is you'll end up getting a very uneven line. But if the design of the car has a mathematically perfect line, just cut all the way to the correct point. In this particular situation, we don't want to do that. But just as a reminder that if you do come across parts like that, just cut all the way through. And you can see here now I'm just cutting all the way through. I'm just following that line along. I'm trying to keep that topology flowing. And this is where we get a little bit more complicated, because now we're introducing these pinches like this. But if you ever come across a pinch like that, where you're cutting through an edge loop to kind of continue another edge loop, you can always just use target weld and just target that back to that point. And then when you remove the inside piece, you're left with that continuing flowing topology. And it doesn't matter about this 5-sided point at the moment, we'll work on that later. So I'm just going to bring this down as well. And now technically, if we grab this point and these points and all these points along here, now from front on, we can kind of dip that until it fits. And just always, I'm just grabbing kind of points and just getting them to flow as close as possible to those lines. We'll introduce more topology down here later. The reason I haven't added that is because I don't want to overcomplicate this surface that's meant to be smoothing flat. So what I mean by that is if we come out here, you can see I want that to flow quite evenly. And if we have to start going in later on and moving points up and down to fit a little bit more accurately, when we add extra points and do that, it just makes our job so much harder, because then we've got to move all these as well and make sure that they're not adding pinches or removing the flow of the topology. Okay, so just so you're not getting a bit lost of where I'm at here, if I just bring up Photoshop and bring this reference image in, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to create this line along here. Trying to create this line along here. And in order to create that hardness, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to add another edge loop along here to create a little bit of pinching. So you can see right now the edge loop's very soft, but if I select those points, and what I can do is I can just get rid of that, because at some point I'm going to need to make all this flow together quite nicely. And in fact, what I can do is if I cut down here and get rid of this point, now that topology is flowing really nicely, whereas before you can see we've kind of just cut it off a little bit and it's causing pinching. So if we get rid of that, now this piece can be treated as its own singular piece, and when we get topology to keep flowing down here, it should behave quite nicely. So back to what I was saying, I've just got this point here, and I'm just going to go up to this point and add a little bit of a chamfer to it, and that's going to give it hardness. And you can kind of see, just like that, we've just added in that hard edge. And later on we can go in and refine how that's going to look. So you can see also now where these blueprints aren't really lining up, we've got a point that looks like it needs to be here from front on. And if I just use my wireframe, my X-ray mode, which is Alt X, you can see that it's lining up here, but now that when we go from above, it's not lining up. So this is a perfect example where blueprints aren't completely reliable, but if you do go from front on, I'd say it's better just to focus on matching the depth of that curve and to use the top viewport for getting things like the actual proportions of those cuts. The reason I say that is because if this blueprint has been traced over another inaccurate blueprint, and you have to remember blueprints.com, in order to use in order to sell these vector file formats, they have to trace over other blueprints. So you don't actually ever know the accuracy. And at the very end of the project, usually you'd go in and just start looking at the reference quite heavily and just gauging for yourself what you need to change. So I'm just going to get rid of this point now as well. And now you can see our bonnet's kind of flowing up here quite nicely, even though the topology is very low res. And then if I really wanted to, I could grab these points and just continue them down. And that's going to serve as that kind of scoop. And at this point, I'm just going to eyeball that into place. You can see we've kind of got some rough guidelines of where that's meant to go. Also note that I've got a lot of that speed that I'm modeling with comes from having a really nice finger alignment on the keyboard. And we spoke about that in the first lesson. But once again, I just want to reiterate, I've constantly got my finger on S, because while I'm modeling, you'll see I'm hitting spacebar and S, and then I've kind of got my index finger over the numbers, so that when I want to change sub-object selection modes, it's all the main keys I'm pressing are readily accessible without having to look at the keyboard, without having to wonder what I'm doing. So while you're practicing, just make sure that you are sticking to those core fundamentals of working with a very strict hand placement, and make sure you're not conditioning yourself to use the wrong techniques, because I'm sure a lot of the advanced guys on the course who've kind of signed up for later down the road when we're doing some more tricky stuff, they take it a bit for granted that when you're starting out, you do things like look at the keyboard a lot to check mistakes and things like that. You can see what I can do here. I can kind of just use, what I've done is I've hit C to turn on edge constraint toggle, and I'm just going to move that in a little bit, and we're just going to start to create and match that shape we're seeing here. Just roughly, it doesn't need to be perfect at this point, we're just trying to block things out. So you can see I'm very quickly sometimes turning on edge constraint toggle on and off, and that's because a lot of the times while I'm modeling, there's just quick little things I need to do to stay snapped, and I'll just kind of I'll swap between hitting S, C, and tilde, and it just becomes a very repetitive combination. And when you are hearing my keyboard go off, and in this lesson I'll try and make sure that those hotkeys are visible that I'm clicking. Camtasia I think does a pretty good job of it, but I could probably figure out a way to get it a little bit more detailed on screen for you guys, so you know exactly what combination of keys I'm pressing. But for now I've only got Camtasia to work with, so I'll do my best, but I'll We'll keep going now. So now I'm just going to connect through here. And I noticed before that, and I might not have mentioned this so far in the course, when you use the options box for each tool, it stores it when you click tick. So if I set this to, say, mine to 658, and I do it again, it's going to automatically keep those settings there. So if you do see that the last time you used connect it was a little bit off center, just try and store that information in your mind so that the next time you go to click that button, you're not clicking connect and making that mistake of it being in the wrong place and having to fix it. Now these are some pretty advanced things to remember early on, but I'm just trying to drop, every little thing that I focus on while modeling. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to reset that to 0, and if you bring up these sliders and right click them, it will reset all the options. So if I just set whatever settings I want here, I can just right click and it goes back to the defaults. So don't feel too intimidated if I'm kind of jumping back and forth between things here, because the ultimate goal is for you to focus on how I'm explaining what I'm doing. I wouldn't want you guys to follow along in this tutorial and kind of pause the video, drag out a polygon and move it in place and then start it again. The goal is, and even if your model doesn't look as good as mine while you're practicing, the goal is to kind of follow along and use at least the same process and same workflow. So like I was saying, I'm modeling slower than I would in production to try and make it understandable for you guys, but I'm also not trying to go so slow that it's so boring that it takes 20 hours for you to see how to model a car. It's not really the point of this lesson. So now I'm just going to drag out this front point on the car. And actually, before I do that, I'm just going to drag the whole thing out because I want to keep that topology rolling. And what I can do on these points is, where they go to a little pinch, is I can grab all of them and just scale them in. So I've just hit R to scale those in, and then I just move them into place. And now you see on the front, I've accidentally moved that off 0. So what I need to do is down the bottom here, if I just select that and move it, it gives me a clue as to which axis mode I'm moving that on. So if you forget, just what I'd like to do is, whenever I've got something off center a little bit, I'll just select it and jig it a little bit, and then I know that it's a center Y axis that I can go in and just 0 off. And now we're back to where we were. It's going to add 2 points in between there. And remember, I was saying in the last lesson that we just want to kind of put edge constraint on and just move that until the geometry is flowing correctly. We don't want as an exaggeration, we don't want it to be off center. Everything kind of has to flow in some way, shape or form with the rest of the topology on the car. And you can see things like this that just look really ugly. What we can do there is I can just go in, and because we knew earlier when I selected those vertices and moved them up and down that we were on the y-axis, it also gives you another clue as to what to use when you're using the the constraint snap tool, or the planar, make planar tool. So if I use Y now, it's going to do the same thing as if I zeroed off vertically in this viewport. And another cool thing we can do is, I'll just go to a different viewpoint for this, is when we've snapped that, if I put on edge constraint toggle, and you can see we're aligned here, the problem is now is that that topology is flowing horizontally with the car, and it's not kind of flowing along the rest of the car's lines. So what I like to do in these scenarios is I like to turn on edge constraint toggle, and if you just rotate all at once, it keeps those vertices snapped, and you won't cause any pinching this way. Or if you do have a more complicated surface, it's going to reduce the pinching as much as physically possible doing it this way. So that's the best way of doing that. So I'm just going to go silent for a little bit now that I've kind of explained some of these techniques that I'm going to be repeating over the next couple of minutes, and I'll just start blocking out a little bit more at my own pace. I'm just going to move all those points down, and now one by one I'm just going to raise those vertices until they're lining up correctly. I'm also just going to raise these points up, even though I don't know exactly where they should be from this view. Once again, if I move this vertex up here, we're going to get a little bit of an overlap, so I just need to move those up. At this point, where I don't want to have to go in, it's much quicker for me to just select the whole face and move that up, and then start moving the vertices again. Here I'm just going to cut a little point and then target weld that up to the top. I'm just bringing up Photoshop just so I can change my view again and see the car from a different angle and just get a fresh perspective on what I'm trying to model. You can see just cutting this edge loop here is just going to harden that off, and we start to kind of cut together the shapes of the bonnet. And all the while the topology is extremely low res. So what I can do next is, now that I've got that all blocked out, I'm just going to go from side on, and I'm just going to drag this down. Now what I don't like that's happening here is is we have a very uneven distribution of polygons. You can see we've got a big polygon, a little polygon, and then a big polygon, three big polygons again. So the goal is ultimately to keep everything similar size. So because I know that this piece has that cut line in it, later on I know that I'm not going to necessarily need this point here, and if I just get rid of that now before it's kind of too complicated in our mind, it doesn't matter about that little rotating point. We just want to make sure that the overall car is got the nice flowing topology. At this point, I haven't gone in and started refining any details yet, so it's very important to remember that. Here though, we know that there's going to be, if I bring up the front of the car, and I'm sorry I kind of have to do this, you can see here where it goes up to a little bit of a dip. And we've got this edge that we're just going to have to work with and start cutting in. You can see there, here's a cool little trick. I want to add a point, so I don't have any detail here, but I also don't want to remove the cleanliness of this point. What I can do is I can cut down here, move the vertex into place where I need it to be, select the edge, and then, select the edge, and rather than hit Control Remove, which is going to remove the vertices around it, I just hit Remove, and now I've got a point. I'm going to have to remove that as well. And there you go. We've created that kind of clean shape, and we know we're not ruining the topology of the car. So once again, I've just cut through, and we've got a little bit of a pinch, but it doesn't matter because I'm just trying to block out the topology a little bit more nicely. So don't worry about that pinching just yet. We'll work it out in a second. So now I'm just going to select this inside loop. I don't want to go too far, so what I'd like to do sometimes is I'll just select the edge loop with Control L, drag it out, and then just using Alt, I'll just unselect the areas I don't want to have to drag out. So now when I pull out this piece that's going to define that shoulder on the first tire, it's not adding too much detail too soon. I'm just going to hide that and just take a look at the blueprint without any of the car there, just so that I've got another idea of kind of how that shape is flowing. And when I see my bonnet that I pulled out and hide it again, you'll see that the only points we're focused on are these, yet if you look at this horizontal line here that has been created, where it actually needs to go is up here. So I can just pull that up a little bit. Now I'm going to try and keep the next set of lines flowing along with that hard point that we saw earlier. So when I drag this up, I'm just sticking to that new point we've created, and I've got edge constraint toggle selected, even though it doesn't really matter at this point, but I do have it selected. I'm just going to connect those two together. Now if I go back to the edge selection mode, once again I've got all those edges selected that I wanted, and if I turn off edge constraint toggle, I can just pull those out. If you ever see things like that search box pop up, just know that that's not intentional. That's just kind of a mistake, just selecting the wrong hotkey. Now once again, now I've got to align it to this line here, because that's going to define the angle on that shoulder. Just taking a little bit of a look, making sure everything's all good. And you'll notice I haven't worried about the light inset at the moment. I'm just worried about trying to make sure that this shape is flowing correctly. And now that we've done that, I can just start kind of tying together a couple of those pieces. Because I've got not enough geometry here, I'm just going to go in and cut another loop. And now that I've cut that loop, I just want to go from side on and make sure that things are still flowing correctly. And at this point, I can probably even get rid of that point there. I just don't need it. And I'm just going to merge this point up here and then flow this along here. Now this lesson is a little bit too early to be getting into how to redirect topology loops and things like that. I will cover that in the next lesson. Like I was saying, I'm just trying to get us to that point where I can focus on those topics, and hopefully as you're modeling the car, you kind of won't need step-by-step instructions to do absolutely everything, because the workflow does accommodate beginners. I'm just going to get this point here. You'll notice that sometimes I don't connect from the earliest point, and the reason I'm going to connect from down here is because that's the point where we want topology to flow from. I don't want to have to cut down here and then connect it. So you may as well just keep the topology flowing from the most accurate point and then worry about cleaning things up like this later, as opposed to the other way around, cutting from here and then cleaning everything else up to match to that. And this is another instance where that annoying blueprint issue happens, where from front on we're aligned here, but from side on we're not. So in order to try and fix that, I can kind of push things on both angles and hope that kind of that's going to solve it. Okay, so now the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to start creating that little bit of a dip in the main front grille, or the main bonnet, and we're going to start incorporating that into the overall shape. So once again, I've just selected that loop, and it's selected a whole bunch of other stuff I don't need, so I'm just going to go in and unselect that, And we're going to unselect all the way up until the point that we created. And now what I'm going to do from front on is I'm just going to go a little bit down here, and I'm going to drag those points like that. Now this last point, I'm just going to lift back up to where I want it to be. And that's going to even out that topology. And I'm just going to select that same loop that we just started with, undo the same selection, and because that point is a hard point, and it's a very hard point, I'm just going to add a little bit of a chamfer to it to give it some hardness. Now for all these points along here, I'm just going to unselect everything I don't need again, turn on edge constraint, and I'm just going to slide those up a little bit. And you can see when I slide it up to here, it starts overlapping, and that topology is not flowing really nicely. But when I get it to there and it starts flowing at the correct angle, I can pull it back down, and you've got a nice clean support loop. All these things don't worry, I'm not going to show you these things once. They pop up while modeling over and over again, and it's only a few little things like that to remember, but I will keep reiterating to you guys to just so you memorize things, and you memorize when to notice things like that happening. So now I can start to dip this point in, and same as usual, I've selected the loop, I unselect the points that I don't want. In this case, I'm going to go just to there, and now front on, I can kind of see that I'm a little bit too far in here on this point. And I think that's because, and it can get a little bit confusing, that's not actually a line on the car that has any kind of hard shape. That's just some rounded point that gets softened off, and the blueprint is describing that with a hard curve, but in reality there isn't actually anything in there. So what I need to do is I need to go back to the top and move these points in. Because you will make mistakes like that. I still make all those mistakes, and the idea is that if you do make a mistake, just correct it. No one's flawless. No one's going to do everything perfect or read the blueprints absolutely perfect. So I'm just going to select a couple of these edges, and possibly now is the time where I can move these in and just get things lining up a little bit nicer. So I've got edge constraint on, and this is where I'm just going in and just getting these getting this topology connecting up a little bit nicer. And you can see it's going to result in needing another edge loop along here. So now I can select all these and connect them cleanly. You can see here, for some reason, it's not bridging, and that's because I've accidentally selected this bonus edge there. And I've just connected that, and we're starting to get a little bit of shape showing up here. But obviously this point's pretty incorrect. So what I want to do to fix that is I just want to select it. Same as usual, just unselect those parts. And I'm just going to move this point down. And in. And now I can just connect this point and just cap it off. So it's a bit interesting now because we've got a really messy point, And this is where we kind of need to make sure that everything's still flowing correctly. So I'm just going to get the edge point out, I'm going to get the cut tool out, and I'm just going to connect a loop through here so that we do keep that continuity. And when we do remove this loop and add another loop in here, that we keep that all nice and clean. And you'll see what I've done there is I've accidentally missed one point, but I'm just going to zoom in and fix that up with target weld. That'll happen a lot. Okay. I have a feeling that this line is going to need quite a lot of modification because the blueprint doesn't actually give us much to work with when it comes to visualizing that point. But I'm just going to do my best to kind of visualize it as well as I can without these really high quality blueprints. But at the same time, it's good to remember that blueprints like this actually are quite high quality compared to some things you can get where they're just so out of whack you can't even use them. So now this line, now that I've connected this piece in between, I'm starting to see that that actually is a point, and I can use that to my advantage. So I'm going to connect those two up, and usually I'd have that mapped to G. It's not working for some reason, probably because things have crashed in the past. But I'm just going to go to Customize User Interface. I'm going to go to Connect. I'm going to go to Connect Vertex in Poly Mode, hit G and assign. And now when I hit G, those two will connect. And once again, we've got this issue where that topology just isn't flowing. So before I connect that, I'm just going to make sure that this line is lining up a little bit closer. And now I've got edge constraint toggle selected, and once again you'll notice that this edge is a little bit messy. So just once again, things I like to do to clean that is I can just use edge constraint toggle, slide it in, and when I slide it back off, that edge is very clean. And I've got control over the hardness there. And you can start to see that the shape of the car becomes a little bit more blocked out. At this point, it's probably a good idea to take a closer look at your model and double check for things like pinching, and just double check to see what you can do to kind of fix up and continue the cleanliness of this topology. So there's a couple of things here that kind of just aren't working that well that I'm going to take a little bit of a closer look at and start to clean up. Things like this line here, this point here that's pinching, we're just going to tidy up a little bit, and we're going to do that by cutting in that line that's running along the bonnet. So I'm just going to bring up my reference. You can see here, once again, I'm just taking a look, kind of analyzing how the curves are flowing, just taking a look at everything. And while you're modeling, you'll be doing the same thing. Hopefully you do have an extra screen or two so you can just continually look at this stuff like I've been doing the whole lesson. But we're just going to go in and we're just going to cut this line in. And then also we're going to add in the topology to keep this flowing up here. So often what I'll do is I'll just move it, and if edge constraint toggle isn't selected, I know that I can just quickly go Control Z C, and that will snap it in. So it's all kind of real-time process where it's just wrong, hit C, slide it, and then hit C again straight away. I'm just going to cut through here. Now what I want to do is I want to make sure, and you can start to see a little bit of a pattern emerging, I always try and keep the distribution of polygons flowing nicely. So you can see here now things are just flowing a little bit better, and when I do go into this point and kind of raise it up a little bit, and when I do that I just want to unselect this point because we know that's flat. We've got a bit nicer shape to deal with. Okay, so now I'm just going to quickly zoom in here, and I'm going to start cutting that line. Now a lot of guys leave this stuff right till the end, but as you'll see, when I model, I try and stick to 3 basic guidelines. First, I block out the main topology, then I fill the topology and connect those points, and then lastly I go in and start detailing them. If you stick to that workflow, you don't have to do everything on the car at once. You don't have to block out every edge. In fact, you can do the whole car just like I've been doing as you go, just as long as you stick to that process of keeping things first very simple, then blocking out, and then going into detail. So it doesn't matter if, for example, I just want to stop working on that piece that I was working on for a little bit, and I just want to go into this point here and start dragging out that edge loop. I can go in and make sure that I've got the topology flowing along the edge of the car here, flowing correctly. So what I'm going to do to make that happen is I'm going to go in, I'm going to cut an edge loop along here, and then I'm going to go into here, and this is where it gets a little bit tricky, because I'm going to move that point down, and I'm going to select the cut tool again, and I'm just going to keep that point flowing. So now you can see we're starting to block out that shape there. Once again, I don't really worry about the topology so much, as long as, at this point anyway, as long as I've got the topology flowing correctly. I'll worry about the shape of that flowing topology a little bit later. So you might need to just cut down here, and you can just experiment with that, whatever works for you. Now I'm going to connect that piece to there. From side on, you're going to see we're a little bit out of sync here. So I'm just going to drag that point back and get it sitting along the correct edge line. Okay, so now we've got an interesting point. At the front of the car, we want this topology to keep swinging in and flowing around. So what I'm going to do to make that happen is I'm just going to go from side on, and you can see at this point here, I'm just going to add another edge loop and start connecting up. You can see it's just caused a little bit of a pinch there. When that happens, if I go back, what I've done is sometimes Max bugs out, and you'll cut an edge and then it doesn't continue on. And when that happens, it just means that the edge is kind of snapped to an incorrect spot. So I'll get the connect tool and just snap that up together, and then just keep cutting again. And now you can see we've got the edge loops flowing, and if I delete this point here and connect this point, select this point here and connect through, and I delete this point, just doing my best to keep that distribution of polygons even once again. What I can do now is I can kind of get rid of that point. When I get rid of this point, now if I drag both of these down, and this once again, it's a little bit complex, don't worry, I will show you how the theory behind all this, but it's just a little bit too complicated at the moment for the beginners. But now you can see we're starting to redirect the flow of topology to be a little bit more even. And now when I get up to this point here, I can keep that flowing. And without making any mistakes and in the shortest way possible, I've totally re-cleaned up that topology, and everything should be flowing a lot nicer now. And we've got support loops where that light's going to go a little bit later. Just going to continue that down there. That we've got too much geometry here right now to deal with, and that will cause pinches. So we're going to have to work with that a little bit later and sort those issues out. But at least now the topology down here is much cleaner. And now I can kind of just drag out a point here. And what I might need to do is, you can see we've got our topology flowing correctly for a certain point, but it's not lining up to the wheel arc. So that's where you just need to readjust your wheel arc, delete this point, and then when I deleted that, I didn't hold control. When I hold control, it removes the vertices along with it. And you can see we're just starting to drag up a little bit here. And if I just connect this point now, and I bridge these 2 points, just going to connect that, push that to there, and I'll worry about that little point later. So now we've got a bunch of points, and I just want to get those even again. Just so everything's flowing. I'm going to bring this point down and just connect that there. And what that's going to do is it's just going to bridge all the points so that the only points we need to move are these 3 points in the middle. And this is the importance, and you're starting to see that when I do block out these shapes, how important it is to have these correct support loops laid down. So you can see when I select it, it's flowing all along with the car. So later on when we're modeling, those loops will remain selectable like that, and it just saves you so much time. And as we continue, and in the next part of the lesson, you'll also see that just shaping up more and more, and you'll see the benefit of this workflow, because it does take a lot of the guesswork out of trying to figure out what type of topology your car needs to flow with. Because if you block out these shapes here, it's just so much work cutting points and cleaning points like this, as opposed to just connecting them. So now I'm just going to connect all of these together. See, that's just not welding, so we might have a little bit of an issue here. So I'll just go to perspective, and I'm just going to remove that. If that's still not target welding, what I can do is I can cut along here, select that face, because sometimes you will get little buggy things like that occurring. Now I can cap that, select that, and remove it. And when you get pretty quick at modeling, all that will become very, very fast. Make sure that that's nice and evenly distributed. Remember, when you have that line going in between, it has to be the average of this line and this line. The inside has to be an average of that. So now from the front, I can just start to kind of shape things up a little bit. And you can see it's when you're working with that edge constraint toggle, it becomes a little bit of an issue when you start to work quickly, because you don't know, you can't remember if you've got it on or off or not. And because I'm recording this tutorial and I'm trying to focus on teaching you guys, little details like that kind of tend to become a bit more messy. Whereas if I was just modeling without any distractions and all I had was music on, things like that probably wouldn't happen near as much because I'm focusing a lot more on the actual modeling part instead of the training part. So just keep that in mind. Don't get into the bad habit of, not remembering when you've turned edge constraint toggle on. That's a little bit annoying. Sorry about that. Now we're just going to come back to this point. And I know we got a little bit sidetracked there, but you can see I'm just going to zoom in on this point. And because I've connected that loop around, when I attach that point, it all just kind of works. But now we've got this point where it needs to stay hard, but at the same time, we don't want all these loops coming together. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to connect this point up to here. I'm going to connect this point up to here. And now using this in between part, I can get rid of it and it just smooths off nice and clean like that. If I connect in here, I can start to kind of pull in that shape of the light. But I'm just going to leave that a little bit. Okay, so we were going to add that line in between here. So once again, I'm just going to go in and cut that together. And now that point there can get taken out. And when I do remove that point, I've just got to remember to keep the distance spacing, because if I go back here, that point, it's not even. So when I get rid of it, it automatically removes the other part too. So I just got to make sure that that's all just kind of continuing along. And the topology is as low res as possible. I'm going to add in another edge loop along the center here. hit C. And you can see what's happening again is if I need to go into configure viewport and disable selected with edge faces because it was doing that thing again. And there you go. So I'm going to wrap the lesson up at this point just because I feel like I don't want to overload you once again, and maybe even tomorrow I'll just go in and record another lesson just continuing on from this process and just kind of breaking down the whole the way to keep everything clean. As you continue the model, you can see all the topologies flowing exactly over the lines, and you don't need so much geometry because we've placed all those edge loops in the most optimized way possible. That's due to modeling with the Turbo Smooth enabled, which is a huge bonus, and it just makes everything so much easier to understand when the geometry is so simple like this. So say for example I want to pull that down here and I'm looking at the reference and this has just a little bit of shape to it. Because we've modeled things cleanly, I can select that loop and know that it's just going to be much easier to connect pieces in between. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to bring up you'll notice I don't really use many tools. I just use cut, move, and target weld and connect. Those are basically the only tools you need, but occasionally there's going to be things where you can benefit from certain things, and one of those things in the graphite tools is the flow connect, and if I just select that, you'll just see it creates a little bit of roundness. We'll cover this in different lessons, but it's just a cool tool you can see the difference there. It's subtle, but when I go into loops, just pay attention to this area here. It just gives us that roundness. And for things like cars, that's going to be extremely important later when you go on to render it, because if you don't have those curves, the reflections aren't going to look very pretty at all. So once again, thanks heaps guys. I hope you're enjoying the course. I really appreciate it when you guys share your progress on the forums, because I want to better judge kind of what to expect from you guys and what you're capable of. So far I'm really loving what I'm seeing though, and it's really awesome, and I'm really motivated to keep this course rolling. Otherwise I wouldn't have done this lesson today. I would have just taken a rest. Thanks heaps guys. See you later.